Well, hi there. Today we're looking at Psalm 3, and it would be great if you could have a read of that psalm before we move any further on. Psalm 3 is categorized as a personal lament, like many other psalms. David wrote this psalm after he'd fled Jerusalem when his son Absalom took over the throne. And so it involves trouble and conflict, and David expresses that in the first couple of verses. David knew that God is a very present help in trouble. Absalom had taken a long time to build up his support for taking over the kingdom, and the number increased day by day. Absalom was handsome, he was smooth-spoken, he was a gifted liar, he knew how to please people. In a sense, he was a con man. And not only were David's enemies increasing, but the news was getting worse. People were saying God will not deliver him. They thought this was the end for David. Why had God permitted such a dangerous situation for David? Well, it was really part of God's punishment because of the adultery and murder. It's the consequences of those actions. God in his grace forgave David when he confessed sins, but he allowed David to reap the consequences of those sins. He experienced painful family problems, including the death of his son, who was born to Bathsheba, also the rape of his daughter Tamar, and the slaying of his sons Amnon, Absalom, and Adonijah. All of that was very painful, and of course part of this process was Absalom taking over the kingship. But David still had confidence in God. In verse 3 and 4 he says, "But you are a shield around me, O Lord. You bestow glory on me and lift up my head. To the Lord I will cry out, and he answers me from his holy hill." Without ignoring his problems, he lifted his eyes from the threatening situation around him, and he looked by faith to the Lord. David knew he was in danger. God was his shield. David depended on God as his shield, and David was in disgrace because of his own sins and the treachery of his son, but God was the source of his glory and his hope. The situation was discouraging, but David knew that God would restore him to his throne. His faith was on the promises that God had made to him, and he knew God would not forsake him. David may have been forced off his throne, but God was still on the throne. God was still in control. David kept crying out to God in prayer, knowing that God would not forsake him, and that the past, as he'd been faithful in the past, he would be faithful into the future. And the psalm ends with David celebrating. He anticipates the victory in verses 5 to 8. When David awakened in the morning, his first thought was of the Lord and how God had protected him during the night. This was a sign to him that God was with him and would see him through the crisis. It reminds us of Jesus asleep in the storm. And if we trust God and seek to do his will, God works on our behalf even when we're asleep. The morning was the most important time of the day for David. It was the morning that he met with the Lord and worshipped him. It was his time to pray and sing and be satisfied by God's mercy. In Psalm 30 and verse 5 it says, "For his anger is but for a moment, his favour is for life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." David knew that the love of the Lord was with him, and he wanted to live in fellowship with God. He couldn't offer animal sacrifices or worship in the temple where he was, but the glory of the Lord was with him, and so he worshipped God. David had the faith to trust God, and he had the faith to believe that God would bring him victory, and ultimately he did. Absalom and his army was defeated, and God restored David to his throne. I hope you can join me again tomorrow. Bye for now.